Alrighty. Well, my name is Sarah Music. I'm with the Colorado Department of Agriculture. I'm the Produce Safety Coordinator, and I just want to welcome you to the Cleaning and Sanitizing webinar with a focus on food contact surfaces. Dwayne Sinning is also on. He's the Program Manager of the Produce Safety Program, so you might hear him chime in every once in a while. So we're going to just get started here. So here's the agenda. These are the things that we'll be going through. So there's 4 steps for cleaning and sanitizing. If that kind of rings a bell, we went over these if you've taken a Produce Safety Alliance or PSA grower training. So just wanting to emphasize those zones of a pack house. So specifically those food contact surfaces. Even if you don't have a pack house, knowing what your food contact surfaces or what zones that we're talking about also is pretty relevant as well. We will touch on equipment design and retrofitting, reducing and assessing your risk. So that way you can kind of take that back to your growing operation, any record requirements, resources that we have, and then of course, questions. Feel free during the presentation, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. We'll answer them at the end. So yeah, let's just get started. So to start off, we always want to have a definition, right, of what are we talking about when we're saying cleaning and sanitizing. They are 2 different things. Sometimes they're intermixed or interchanged, and they're not. So what cleaning is the physical removal of dirt or debris from surfaces. And you can do that with clean water and detergent. Again, we'll be going over what the 4 steps are of what cleaning is. And then sanitizing is then treating that clean surface to eliminate or reduce pathogens. So that's why that's in bold at the bottom. You cannot sanitize a dirty surface. You have to clean it first and then use your sanitizer. So that way you're getting the most out of your sanitizer. So then what are those 4 steps that I've been alluding to? So the first step is removing any of that dirt and debris from your food contact surface. So that could be your harvest bin, that could be your pack line, whatever that looks like. You can do that with a brush, scrub it off. There are farms that use power washers. Nothing in the world says you can't. However, if you're using water, it has to meet the harvest and post-harvest ag water requirements. I'm going to touch on that a little bit down here in step 3 and 4. But we did create an ag water webinar in March. If you want to go to our website and watch that to get the full requirements of what that is, but it's no detectable generic E. coli for your water, right? If you're using a power washer, and then also making sure if you are using a power washer that the debris doesn't then contaminate your food surfaces there as well. So kind of just something to kind of keep in mind off as far as like if you're wanting to use a power washer where you're using it. And then for step 2, applying a detergent and scrubbing the surface, right? Because you're wanting to break up that biofilm that may be there from bacteria, right? And then, so detergent's just a fancy word. Dawn dish soap is a detergent. Making sure that it's appropriate for food contact surfaces. Dish soap, Dawn works just as well. You can use it. Then making sure to scrub it, minimizing that biofilm, and then going on then to step 3. So then you've scrubbed it, brushed it off, right? Used the detergent, scrubbed it again, and then rinsing it with clean water, making sure all that soil that was there, if there is any, and detergent is getting taken off. Again, that water would have to meet the harvest and post-harvest requirement, which is right here, no detectable generic E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample. And just having records showing that your water makes that. Again, we did make an ag water webinar that kind of goes over the requirements of what that looks like. So you can watch that. And then if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And then after you've done all of that, comes step 4, which is applying your sanitizer. So sanitizing. Now, something that I always want to bring to people's attention is making sure your sanitizer is approved for food contact surface. A good example is Sanidate. Some of them are only approved for water to wash the vegetables, and some are only for food contact surfaces, and then some are for both. So just making sure that whatever sanitizer that you're using is supposed to be used on a food contact surface. I will be sending out later on when I send a follow-up email, there's a sanitizer list that the EPA created, and I can send that to you so that way you can check to make sure is the sanitizer you're using appropriate. And then of course, following the directions on the label so that way you're mixing it correctly. And then there are some sanitizers that require a rinse. After you put it on, you set it on there for, an example would be 10 minutes, whatever the label tells you, and then you have to rinse it off again. So making sure that you're reading the label and following what the label tells you because you may have to rinse it again, just again, depending on what sanitizer you use. So once you clean and sanitize, you create what's called a clean break, right? So when you clean and sanitize those food contact surfaces or anything else, right, tools, then you've established a clean break. Why is that important? Then you can establish lock codes for a recall. So then that way you're able to show I have cleaned and sanitized here, and it limits how much you would have to pull if, heaven forbid, knock on wood, right, there was to ever be an outbreak and you would have to recall any of your produce. Documentation is always key, right? Keeping records of when you're cleaning, when you're sanitizing, and how it was cleaned, having standard operating procedure or SOPs in order to do so goes a long way. We do have templates, and I'll be showing that towards the end of this presentation, but there are templates available for cleaning and sanitizing. You don't have to start from scratch if that's something that you need to do. So there are templates available, but yeah, keeping a record of when you clean and sanitize is a requirement under the rule, but also it's just good practice as well. So zone. So we're going to be getting into the zones of a pack house. We're using the pack house as an example. It's to help prioritize the cleaning and sanitizing of the different areas in a pack house so you can kind of assess what risks that you have specifically, what zones you would need to focus on specifically for your farm operation, right? They're all different. And then while this is focused on a pack house, if you just field pack, if you just transport it from the field, it also helps to kind of start thinking through these different zones of what your farm does. So that way there's, you're eliminating your contamination risk. So yes, we're using a pack house as an example, but if you just field pack, the zones are still appropriate for that as well. So zone 1, if you've had an on-farm readiness review with me, you may have heard me use this verbiage. What are your zone 1s? What are your food contact surfaces? So that's what your zone 1 is. Any surface that comes into direct contact with any of your fresh produce. What can that be, right? I gave some examples here. It's not exhaustive, but brushers, rollers, sorters, workers' hands. If they use gloves, that would be a food contact surface. And then in the field as well, if you're laying it on the ground, that could be a food contact surface. So it's anything that comes into contact, whether intentionally or not. So just kind of start thinking through what are those zone 1s in your operation? What does that look like? Now, the rule does require any of those food contact surfaces of equipment to be inspected, maintained, and cleaned, right? Because we don't want them to be able to be the contamination point of any of those pathogens, right? Like E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, right? We don't want any of that becoming the issue. And then sanitize when necessary and appropriate. Yes, that's worded that way. That's what the rule says. So, however that looks like for your farm, make sure that you have a schedule of when you want to sanitize your equipment. So again, you're creating that clean break. So if there were, again, any recalls, that is what you can rely on and then go to your records to show. And then very quickly, so then there's zones 2, 3, and 4. So zone 2 is area immediately adjacent to your zone 1. So if you think like through a pack house, it would be the outside or the inside of like your sorting table, if you have one, or a flume or anything on the edges, right? Zone twos could quickly become zone ones. And I'll kind of show that. I do have some photos later on that I'll be kind of going through this a little bit more in depth. And then your zone threes, that's your adjacent to your zone twos. So kind of thinking high level of like if you have coal bins, your floors, any drains that you may have, anywhere that kind of comes into contact but isn't directly, right? And then zone four, that could be, it can impact food safety, and it could be like the building that it's in or adjacent land or the ground or anywhere near that area that could potentially cause contamination. So these are important areas to kind of think about, even though they're not direct food contact surfaces, they can pose risk as well. So kind of start thinking, yeah, I have direct food contact surfaces, but what are my zones twos and threes that I might have to put some thought into of how to mitigate and assess my risk there. So then equipment design, right? So you have your sorters and your belts and all of that. Those direct food contact surfaces should be, of course, non-toxic because it is raw produce that we're talking about. We don't want it to make an area of where being and then non-absorbent. So making sure that it's not getting into your produce and then causing, even if it's not pathogens, becoming something that is an issue, right? And then durable, withstand corrosion, right? Because corrosion could cause some issues, especially if it's rusting and then it's rubbing against produce. You could be causing micro tears, which then could potentially have the risk of pathogens getting into your produce. And then, of course, with equipment design, able to be easily cleaned and sanitized. We want it to be that way, so that way, again, your equipment isn't becoming a contamination risk for your produce, especially if it's touching you, right? So equipment should be designed and installed to facilitate that, right? So making sure, do you have access to your brushes, your rollers, nozzles even, right? So those zone ones, and even with the nozzles, your zone twos. So that way you can clean them. So again, they're not becoming a contamination risk to your produce. Now, you may be thinking, well, I have older equipment. How can I make my older equipment work? Well, you can. Nothing in the rule says that you have to buy new equipment each year when the new model comes out. We do know equipment is very expensive and that farms have limited resources, either with labor or even just money, right? So farms do find ways to either retrofit or repurpose equipment that they've bought from other farmers or other produce varieties. So if you're growing peppers, but you buy equipment that was used for potatoes, you can do that. However, what is your risk with that? Are there any welds on the equipment that's post-manufactured that was either done by the farmer or done by a professional? Because if it's not a smooth weld, then you're creating pockets where pathogens can potentially grow, right? So when you want to retrofit your equipment, make sure that it's not increasing your risk of contamination. You don't want it to become a pathogen harborage place, right? So making sure that it is done in a way that isn't increasing your risk. And then the rule does state seams on food contact surfaces and equipment need to be smoothly bonded, and maintained to minimize organic material to, again, minimize the harborage or growth of pathogens, right? We don't want to create another situation where a pathogen might be able to grow somewhere, especially if you're retrofitting equipment. So then with direct food contact surfaces, just like I said, we're going to go through some slides. I'm going to show you some pictures, kind of go over, here are the direct food contact surfaces. Here are your zone twos and threes that you might want to consider. because they come into, again, contact and may become a direct food contact surface. So here's the first one. As you can see, this is a sorting belt, right? So the first one, your zone 1, what is your direct food contact surface? As you can see, it's the belt that they're on, right? And so this would be your zone 1, but what we said was like the sides being zone 2s. Well, as we can see, these berries are now touching the sides of this belt. So then they now become a zone 1. They're becoming a direct food contact surface. So kind of pay attention, like if you're at the peak of harvest and this is, what you're seeing, making sure like, are my zone 2s, could they potentially become a zone 1 if it's at the peak of harvest and I'm having a bunch of produce go through my pack line, right? And so then you see a zone 3 here, but you see these workers' hands and it looks like they have some debris on there. It looks like they're probably pulling out anything that doesn't look right, maybe coals. But then again, they're resting their hand on this belt. So that tells us that these are direct food contact surfaces, and then they're touching this. Well, how often is this cleaned? And is this worker, how clean are their hands? Are they, when they come back from break, washing their hands after they use the restroom? Any of that. So your direct food contact surfaces might not be as obvious, but it's where are the hands, where are they touching, where does the produce touch? And it might not be as straightforward. So here's another one, right? So these cucumbers that are laying on a table. Again, this table kind of looks like something you might buy at Target or, IKEA or something like that, right? Might be that like particle board kind of set up here. Well, this becomes a food contact surface. So making sure, can this be cleaned? And when you clean and sanitize it, is it going to corrode it? Is that paint going to start chipping off? So if this is something that you do, put your produce on a table, what's that table made of? Could you put something, could you put the cucumbers in a basket or a bin so it's not coming into contact with the table? Just again, things to kind of think about, assess your risk. Is this something you even do, or is it put into a bin and then into a cooler? So this one I just wanted to show because they were wooden bins and then the straw, right? So again, direct food contact surface, right? Especially the straw, since it's touching, where are you storing that? Is that stored in your pack house? Is it stored outside? Can rodents get in? Is that something that's inspected before it's just put in there? Again, worker training, right? Are they trained to see, like, is there any way that this could come into contact? And then again, wooden bins. Nothing in the rule says you can't use wooden bins. However, they do need to be, if you're reusing them, they need to be cleaned and or sanitized. While wood is harder to do that, you have to make sure that they're air dried. We know that especially on the Western Slope, they still use, for apples, they still use wooden bins. But again, it is a direct food contact surface. So how are you going to clean them? Just something to think about. So then I was just talking about harvest bins and then orchards. So as you can see here, the harvest bins, they're on their sides, right? Looks like I don't know the story behind these, but as you can see, they're laying on their sides here. However, if soil gets in there, especially on the inside where the produce is going to be touching, that's your direct food contact surface. So is it a good idea to put them on their sides? Are your workers looking in the harvest bins to make sure that nothing is sitting in there that shouldn't be, and then reporting it and then moving it to the side if it needs to? These we also know are stacked. So I think their idea was that it keeps these clean so that way they can stack them and then don't pose a risk of the soil then touching their produce, because again, that would be These could be a zone 3, but potentially a zone 2, depending on how much produce they put into those bins. It could become a zone 2 or even a direct food contact surface, depending again how far you fill these bins. And then again, harvest bins, this is great. You're seeing there's plenty of room between here, but again, where were these legs sitting? I specifically chose this photo. I don't know if you can see over here, there's mud. And so were those bins sitting in that mud? Then were they placed on top of each other, ready for harvest? Because again, if that mud dries and then goes in here, that's your direct food contact surface. Is that going to pose a risk for you? And then of course you see the tire tracks in here. So are they picking up these harvest bins with a forklift? What kind of risk is that posing? Are they going to splash the mud onto the bins, which then potentially could get onto, the peaches or the apples or whatever they're harvesting over here? So again, what are your direct food contact surfaces? What are your zone 2s and 3s? Something to just kind of consider. We know it can get muddy, and just to kind of think through that. And then of course with wooden bins, you are allowed to use them, but it's just a little harder to clean and sanitize them. So then we have lemons. I know we don't grow lemons here, but showing the belt. So the belt again is your food contact surface. But then again, as you can see here on the sides, there's a lot of lemons going through here. So your zone 2 here is now a zone 1 because it looks like lemons are touching it. So how often are you cleaning that, right? So making sure, again, are your zone 2s, could they potentially be a zone 1? And then specifically with your equipment, right, is it looks like they're spraying. Is that sprayer, which is a zone 2, could the belt back up enough where the produce can touch that? How close is it getting? And then is it spraying, and is the equipment working, right? Making sure that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, especially if you're injecting something into the water that you're spraying on your produce. I know this is lemons, but typically you see this in like cherries, or if you want to use it for your leafy greens, kind of keep that in mind. Is your equipment working the way it should be? And if it were to touch your produce, how would you clean it? Can you clean it? So this one, I don't know if you can kind of tell. So she is picking cherry tomatoes. Looks like she's putting them in like clear plastic little containers. And then they're being put into a cardboard box. But something that I wanted to point out is sometimes what you'll hear us say is like a sacrificial bin or a sacrifice bin. Well, it looks like she has a sacrifice bucket, right? So that way, the bottom of that cardboard, especially sometimes they have the holes on the bottom, that they're not becoming a food contact surface. So that way, if you have animal intrusion, especially if you're growing outside, right? If there's deer poop or anything along those lines, and they had put that cardboard box in the poop because they didn't see it, then you're possibly contaminating that whole box of produce. And then what else is that box going to be touching? Right? So definitely, something to consider. Are you using a sacrifice bin in order to prevent your zone 2 becoming a zone 1? But making sure that bucket is also cleaned, right? So the top of that bucket isn't touching the soil and then touching the box and then going from there. So making sure that you keep it as clean as possible while moving through the field. Again, I kind of wanted to show, I don't see that this one is a sacrifice bin. So it looks like there's produce in there, and it looks like it's touching the ground. And while these are strawberries, they're in clear plastic containers. You could potentially have soil touching the strawberries that are in here, just depending on what those cardboard boxes are doing, right? And especially if it's touching the ground, and then you're stacking them. So if you're taking this stack and then putting on this one, well, the soil or whatever was on the bottom of this cardboard box is now coming into contact with the strawberries here. So having that sacrifice bin or that sacrifice cardboard box, so that way it doesn't become a contamination point. So then you can stack the boxes knowing that it's not going to pose any risk for you, is something that we always try to emphasize in either on-farm readiness reviews or in inspections. So this is something that they will be seeing, is what's coming into contact with the ground. Is it going to be touching produce? How is it touching the produce? And kind of walking through that. So then I was talking about equipment and tools, right? Sometimes, there's harvest knives that are used, or in this case, they're using scissors. So making sure, like, how often are you cleaning those scissors? Do you have a standard operating procedure? Are they cleaned every day but sanitized every week? Or what is your routine like? Because that is your food contact surface, right? Is the harvesting shears, making sure that they're not becoming a part of the contamination. And then, of course, also hands, right? The hands of the person here looks like they're holding it while they're cutting. Again, how often are they washing their hands? Are they, are your workers, do you train them after every time they come back from a meal break, every time they use the restroom, that they're washing their hands properly? So that way, again, they don't become a contamination source. Now, also something to go along those lines, if you are using gloves, those are still a direct food contact surface. So where are those being placed during breaks, during meal times, or if they're using aprons, anything along those lines? Do they take them into the restroom? Anything along those lines, something to think about. I've seen, as far as like gloves, is like they take them off, they throw them, especially if they are harvesting and then also transporting. So they're driving the truck to the next section that's being harvested. Where are they putting those gloves? Right? Are they putting them in the passenger seat, just throwing them there and then driving the truck, put the gloves on, and then open the car door? Right? Because those are direct food contact surfaces. How clean is your truck when you're moving it? Because again, those gloves are a direct food contact surface at that point. So reducing and then assessing your risk. So as far as that goes, how can you do that? Map the flow of your produce from the field of when you're harvesting it through the packing area into storage and transportation. Now, again, if you don't have a pack house, think through, how do you store it? How do you transport it? Whatever is applicable for you. So mapping where it goes, what touches your produce. So what are your zone ones? What are those food contact surfaces? Is it the worker's hands? Is it the equipment that they're using? Sometimes depending on the produce, it's highly mechanized, but what equipment is involved? And then also identifying your zones 2, 3, and 4. They could have their own food safety risks, their own contamination points, but making sure, if you're covering your zone 1s, don't forget about your 2s, 3s, and 4s, right? You're adjacent to your direct food contact surfaces, your transportation. Is it being cleaned out? Because you don't want to do all this legwork, all this hard work of mapping it out, and then for transportation, the ball is dropped. So making sure that any adjacent food contact surfaces, drains, and your floors are being well maintained. And then also, if you fuel pack, adjacent land, making sure that nothing is a contamination point going through what that looks like for you. Now, if you do have a pack house, have you mapped out the flow of your pack house? Where does the produce come in? Is it the same place that it's leaving from? Do you use a forklift that goes out into the field but then also comes back into your pack house? Is it only in a designated area of your pack house? We do understand, with some small growers that, they use the same equipment for multiple things, but making sure it's not going to contaminate, right? And especially if you're washing your produce, is there any paths that are crossed with the produce that comes from the field and then those that are washed and packed already? Is there any touch points that maybe you can work out, especially if it's going into storage? Maybe designating one part of your cooler as the fresh from the field and the other, maybe a different colored bin. I've seen the whole gambit. Just kind of depends on how you want to assess your risk and then reduce it, whatever works for you. But just kind of mapping the flow is kind of the first step. So that way you can kind of identify, ooh, they do cross paths here. How can I minimize my risk? And then, so you're assessing your risk, you went through your zone ones, here are the areas, writing down that risk assessment that you just went through for your operation. Here are the areas that we know are our trouble points, and then implementing practices that could reduce your risk. This could include these, but not all, right? If you have a better idea, absolutely, right? Implementing and reinforcing that worker training, like a couple of those slides that I showed with the hands touching the sides. You can do what we call like tailgate trainings throughout the harvest season. So there is the requirement that we learned in the record webinar that was last month. For worker training, there's a required record for that, right? But also, if you're seeing something, have a tailgate training. I don't want you touching the sides unless your hands are completely clean, or, make sure that you're washing your hands when you come back from break. Also, if you have a pack house, pest control, right? Making sure that the little critters can't get in, whether that's with traps, making sure that the weeds around your pack house are cut down. So again, minimizing your risk, because mice, all they need is a quarter of an inch and then they're in. So making sure that they're not becoming a contamination point, that would be a zone 4, right? Cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces, again, that record of cleaning and then sanitizing when necessary and appropriate. Now, getting equipment that can be easily cleaned and sanitized. Like I said, you don't have to buy brand new equipment. You can use old equipment, but again, assess your risk with that. And then just because it's new doesn't mean it can be easily cleaned and sanitized. Because equipment companies, that's not what they're looking for. They're just trying to make the shiny new thing that makes your, job easier. But can you take it apart and clean it to make sure that pathogens can't be harbored there? Just something to kind of think about. And then, of course, cleaning and maintaining your coolers and transportation vehicles, right? You don't want to do all this legwork and then drop the ball with your cooler, making sure that floor is swept, making sure that any harvest bins are off of the ground, or that there aren't holes in your harvest bins that could come in contact with the ground. And then, of course, your transportation vehicle, right? If you have control over that, specifically if you have your own refrigerated cooling truck, making sure that it's working, making sure that you sweep it out, right? Or if you're using your own personal vehicle, what else is going in the back, right? Are your dogs going in the back? Did you grab some Miracle Grow from Lowe's the other week and then threw it in there and didn't clean it out? And then you're taking your produce and putting it in the back there for your farmer's market. Again, just things to kind of assess your risk. Of course, we want you to focus on the zone 1s, but don't forget about your 2s, 3s, and 4s. And then, of course, with the produce safety rule, there's always records, right? So there is a requirement to establish and keep a record of what was cleaned, date of cleaning, of the equipment used, right? So anything that you use for your covered produce, any equipment that you use. So that could be even harvesting shears, right? Or if you use full on like tractors and forklifts and anything else like that. Now, this specific record does need to be reviewed, dated, and signed by a supervisor. So that could be you if you're the owner, that could be your food safety manager, your field manager, whoever is the appropriate person to be signing it should be. And then, of course, when I was talking about the 4 steps, using water, right? So your harvest and post-harvest agricultural water, if it comes into contact with produce, you would have to have records to show that there's no detectable generic E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample. Meaning, if you get it from a municipal source, you would just have to have records showing that it meets the drinking requirements for the EPA and or testing to make sure that it doesn't have any, depending on what your water source is. If you use a well, that would be something you would have to do. Again, if you want more in-depth information, up on our website, we have our Ag Water webinar that we did in March. Feel free to take a look through that to get more in-depth information. And then as far as this is what the record template looks like. This is what I'll be sending to you. So again, here it has the date, the time that was cleaned, what was cleaned. So it was harvest tools, method used. So as you see here, cleaning SOP. And then they write out exactly what they did. Having a standard operating procedure, you can just write that there, but make sure it's written down, right? So that way everyone can follow it. And then of course, whoever cleaned and or sanitized would initial here. So as you can see, this was just cleaned, but then the dump tank was cleaned and sanitized with the referenced SOP here. And then again, I had talked about this, right? I'll be sending you the record templates that we had discussed in this. There is an EPA sanitizer list that the PSA or Produce Safety Alliance came up with that you can kind of search through to find out which ones can I use on food contact surfaces. So that way you have the information that you need. And then of course our website, that's where our other webinars are that I have kind of referenced throughout this presentation. Feel free to go there to see that, get any more resources and information that you can find there. And then of course, does anybody have any questions? And then with that, I would like to thank you for coming out, stopping the recording.